So a couple weeks ago, I posted this video where we decked out this DualSense controller in this awesome Sony blue. And by far the number one type of comment I got was, yeah, it's going to be impossible for me to make one of these in all these colors. But I figured I would show you how to do some silicone mold making for resin casting your own awesome PS5 DualSense controller buttons. But in case you're not interested in trying yourself, make sure you stick around and still check out the video, as I'm going to tell you how to win the awesome black button set we cast in this video. So the first thing you're going to need to do is obviously rip open this controller and gain access to those buttons. Now, I'm not going to do a full teardown here, but if you want, check the card in the upper right hand corner for my full teardown on the DualSense controller. Just keep this step I'm doing right now in mind, because I definitely missed it in that video. Now, of course, this process is going to work with any kind of button, not just PS5. So if you're using more of a retro console, so like N64 as you're seeing here, one thing you want to do is make sure you buff out the buttons before you go ahead and start the molding process. Your silicone mold is going to capture any detail in your master, which includes the scrapes and imperfections that may already be there. So take the extra time to do this step so your mold turns out nice and your end product looks fantastic. The only downside to buffing parts like this is, well, you get polishing compound stuck in the button, but that's easy to take care of with a blunt object such as a toothpick. With our buttons finally prepped and ready to go, it's time to build our mold box. My general philosophy when I'm trying to build a mold box is to implement as much registration as possible using a 90-degree angle. And to do that, I'm using this acrylic rectangle bar. And what I want to do is fit that registration around each of my individual buttons. For the base of my mold box, I'm just using some corrugated plastic sheet. I get this stuff from Home Depot. It's fairly inexpensive. I'm sure Amazon has it too, and if I can find a link, I'll post it. But anyway, what I'm going to do is glue that rectangle acrylic bar to my corrugated plastic sheet using that super glue. And it's really nice to have that activator there because it just basically creates an instant bond between the acrylic and between the corrugated plastic sheet. One other thing I'd like to point out here is that my mold box is just a 3D printed, square basically. So what I'm going to do is throw the STL files in the description below. If you don't have a 3D printer, don't worry about it. You can just go ahead and use some of that corrugated plastic sheet and a little bit of hot glue to create the outer perimeter of your mold box. So now we're going to go ahead and adhere the buttons to the actual corrugated plastic sheet or the base of our mold box. And realistically, we're just going through the exact process. We're just using a few toothpicks to do this. And the reason why is we really just don't want that super glue to get all over the place and realistically get on the sides of the buttons because that'll cause some issues with alignment a little bit later on. So you can see I'm just gently applying a little bit of super glue to each of the bottoms of the buttons and adhering the buttons to the base of the mold box. But with all that complete, let's go ahead and set all this stuff to the side and we'll come back to it a little bit later. For now, let's get to some of those other buttons. So one thing that the Create, Options, and D-pad all have in common is they don't have a flat edge to them. So in other words, we can't just lay them flat like we did with the face buttons. Instead, we're going to have to use some of this plastilina clay to kind of prop them up, create a flat surface so we can create our two-part mold. In general, our approach for each of these is pretty much exactly the same. We're going to lay out a small bit of clay and we're going to go ahead and try to get it as flat as we possibly can. We're going to press the piece into it and we're going to try to create that flat edge that's going to run through the equator of the button. With that done, you're going to see me take like this sickle-shaped clay molding tool, and essentially all I'm going to do is try to get that clay to be flush up against the equator of the button, kind of like I mentioned before, and that's all I'm going to do is try to make that as flush as I possibly can. This part's not exactly what I'd call hard, but it's worth taking your time to do because at the end of the day, the more flush it is, the less likely you are to get flashing that's difficult to clean up later on. With the PlayStation logo done, we're going to make our way over to the Create and Options button as well as over to the D-pad, and we're basically just going to rinse and repeat the exact same process. After all that work, you should end up with some buttons that look, well, something similar to what you're looking at right now. Now the last step is to get those buttons adhered to your mold box, and to do that I just roll up a little bit of clay and use that sickle tool to adhere them. Now you can also accomplish this by scraping some of the clay off the side wall, but I like doing it this way because it keeps the shape more consistent overall. And with that done, the last thing we're going to do is take a little bit of isopropyl alcohol and some Q-tips, and we're going to clean everything up. Now, the purpose of this is to get all residual oils or clays from your fingers off the buttons. And we want them to be as clean as possible because, as I mentioned previously, whatever is on your button, whether it be a fingerprint, a smudge, or whatever, is going to show up in your final casting. The last thing you're going to see me do is take a little bit of IPA and the Q-tip, and we're going to go over the clay as well. Now, I like doing this because effectively what that IPA does is it kind of smooths out the clay. So, as you're kind of working with it and you're using your tools and your fingers, you might be creating indents or other kind of jagged pieces of clay. And really what this does is just kind of helps smooth everything over and smooth it down. Now, of course, once you've touched your Q-tip to the clay, clearly you don't want to touch it to your button again. But after going through that entire process, it should look something like this. And you can tell the clay is nice and smooth and the buttons, well, they're shiny the way they should be. So finally, the last step is to get the mold box adhered to your mold base. And for me, I just use some plastilina clay and just kind of force it into the corners between the base and the box with my finger. If you don't want to use plastilina clay, you could also use hot glue to do this, and that would work just as well. With all the hard work out of the way, it's time for the easy part, which is pouring some silicone. We're going to be using some Alumilite Plat 40 here. Now, this specific silicone has a 35-minute working window and a 24-hour demold time. And overall, it's a really nice platinum-based silicone that works really well and lasts for a decent amount of time as well. So from here on out, I recommend you wear gloves because you really don't want to get any of this stuff on your hands. As far as actually pouring the silicone goes, it's incredibly simple. This is a 1-to-1 by volume. So I'm just going to pour parts A and parts B in here and get them measured and do the best of my ability to get it as close as possible. Once I have both parts of the silicone in, I'm going to go ahead and use a stirring stick to mix everything up. And I recommend you do a really, really good job to scrape the sides and the bottom of your container. And you want to spend a good, 2 minutes or so mixing. You don't want to undermix this. My plan is to go ahead and pressure cast my molds. In other words, let the silicone set under pressure. And the following step is probably optional. However, I have the equipment and it's something I recommend doing just because at the end of the day, I've done a lot of work and I don't want to mess up these molds. So let's vacuum degas all the silicone. The goal is to pull 29 inches of mercury, but you just got to be careful because this thing's going to rise to about 3 times its original volume. So you might have to just play with the vacuum to end up getting it correct. But ultimately, you should see the bubbles rise and then they will begin to fall. After a few minutes, you should see virtually no activity sitting in your silicone, and at this point, it is finally time to pour. So when I pour my silicone, typically the way I like to do it is I like to pour into a single corner, and I like to use a very thin stream. The reason why I do it like this is, if there are any, remnant bubbles or anything like that, typically a thin stream will help them pop, and ultimately we don't want to create more bubbles by being too aggressive with our pour. So like I said, taking my time, I've got 35 minutes to work with this particular silicone, and we're going to pour a nice thin stream into both the corners of these molds. And with the silicone all poured, the last thing you want to do is just make sure your mold box is not leaking because, that would be an expensive mess and a big problem. No leaks in the molds. It's time to finally put these things under pressure. Now for my pressure pot, I can go up to 80 PSI, which is pretty high. I use a CA Technology pressure pot. However, I typically don't push it all the way up to the 80 PSI. That's the maximum recommended level. Typically I run about 70 PSI, but realistically anything above 40 is probably sufficient. And the last thing I do is I have a silicone heating pad that heats my pressure pot. So while my parts are in the pressure pot, and the reason why I like them to be heated is really twofold. Number one, it reduces the amount of total demold time. And number two, it brings all of the materials up to their optimal properties faster. So after about 24 hours in the pressure pot, it's time to pull these things out and see how they turned out. And they look pretty good. The one thing I'm going to do here is pull them out of their mold boxes, clean them up a little bit, and if any of the buttons came out, I'm going to put them back in just the way they were. Now the goal is for the buttons not to come out at all, but to the extent that they do, just put them back in just the way they were. We're going to do the exact same thing for the parts that were embedded in the clay. And if the clay is really soft and, difficult to get off the parts, feel free to throw it in the freezer for a little bit and the clay will literally just pop right off. But to the extent there's some clay left over, go ahead and clean it all up with some IPA and get the mold as clean as possible. Next up is to apply some of this silicone to silicone mold release. I use this one from Alumilite. I've also used Man Ease Release 205. Both work absolutely fantastic. But typically what I'll do is apply a minimum of 3 coats to this, and realistically waiting about 5 minutes for each coat to dry. In this case, we definitely want to make sure we apply enough of this because realistically, silicone doesn't stick to anything except for itself. And with all that done, finally time to pour the second half of the mold, and we're going to rinse and repeat the exact silicone process we went through before and get this stuff into the pressure pot. With those molds finally coming out of the pressure pot, it's time to take these out of the mold box, and we're going to very, very gently separate the 2 halves of the molds so as not to rip any of the silicone. There's still going to be 3 things we need to do before we're ready to cast our parts, and those 3 things are: first, we need to clean the mold to get rid of any of the excess oils and or silicone to silicone mold release to make sure it's clean. 2, we need to remove all the backfill from the buttons, and 3, we're going to have to cut our sprues. Cleaning is easy enough. Just use a little bit of IPA and a Q-tip and go ahead and go over the entire mold. Like I said, just getting rid of any of the oils that are left over and other materials used. Next, we're going to remove some of the negative space that sits in the button. Now, manufacturers do this because when you're manufacturing millions of buttons, the incremental savings of the plastic here is probably pretty meaningful. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove that. Now, the reason why we're removing it is twofold. Number 1, it's going to give us more consistent results, and number 2, it's going to make our buttons look better. On the DualSense controller, we're going to be removing it from the D-pad, the options and create button, as well as all the 4 face buttons. So to make the sprues in the mold, I use really 2 different things. I use a cork boring tool as well as a 14 gauge needle. And basically my goal is to put 2 of the larger cork bore holes through each of the buttons, and really I'm trying to do this on the button guides themselves and only trying to capture as little of the actual button guide as I can to make it easier to remove the sprue later on. For all the remaining button guides, I'll use the 14 gauge needle and just push that through as well. The nice thing is the 14 gauge needle comes with the syringes that I've got recommended in the description below. And we'll be reusing those syringes a little bit later on in the process. And hopefully after all those sprues are cut, you end up with something that looks, similar to this. For my resin, I always go with this Alumilite clear. It works really well. It needs to be pressure casted, but it works absolutely fantastic, and I highly recommend it. It works by measuring equal parts of A and B, and it has a 7-minute work window, which for something small like this with these buttons is absolutely perfect. So anyway, let's weigh some of this stuff out, and we're going to mix in some micas, and let's see what we end up getting. One thing that's worthwhile to point out that you're not going to see me do here in the video is to add the mica prior to adding the resin when you're doing your weighing. Now the reason why I didn't do it like this is because, well, I'm working on 2 different things here, so I needed to pull some resin aside for another batch of buttons. Now once you're done mixing your pigment into your resin, the next step is to inject your molds using a syringe. And once those molds have been fully injected, we're going to put these into the pressure pot and subject them to at least 40 psi of pressure. Now typically I go for something a little bit more. I like to use a 60, but again, it depends on the rating of your pressure pot. Mine's rated up to 80 psi. Now the last thing I want to point out is make sure you're always checking the technical data sheet that accompanies your resin. In there, you're going to find all kinds of good advice from how long you need to let the parts cure for before you can demold, as well as any post-curing that might be necessary. Now, since we're dealing with less than 100 grams of resin, I'm going to go ahead and subject this to 150 degrees Fahrenheit of heat while this is curing in the pressure pot for about 2 hours. Now comes my favorite part, which is ripping open the molds and seeing how we did. And honestly, these black parts look absolutely amazing. So the only thing left to do is clean up any flashing, then remove the sprues and use a jeweler's file to sand the area where the sprue was and our finished part. And after that's all done, you should end up with something that looks like this. And while these black parts look absolutely awesome, putting them on a controller just brings it to the next level. So about that giveaway, here's how you enter. All you got to do is be subscribed to the channel, like the video, and drop a comment below, and I'll pick a winner in 2 weeks' time, and I'll ship that anywhere in the world. So pretty easy to enter. If you're looking for more ways to enter, take a look at the Gleam link in the description below to the video and in the pinned comment, and you can get some additional entries just following those instructions. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you check out this one here at the end where we absolutely deck out a DualSense controller and make it look absolutely awesome with tons of custom parts.